want to invite you to join me in welcoming our distinguished panel and moderator to the floor. And together they're going to help us synthesize this global research agenda for building inclusive learning environments. And we call this discussion Educate, Unify, and Change, Closing Knowledge Gaps to Build Inclusive Learning Environments. So leading this conversation is our moderator, Professor Nidhi Singhal, a globally recognized scholar whose work focuses on educational equity for marginalized groups, particularly children with disabilities. She's a trusted advisor to key international organizations, including the World Bank, UNESCO, and several NGOs. And notably, she contributed to the International Statement of Action for the Global Disability Summit, which was endorsed by 31 global organizations. So with her deep expertise and passionate advocacy for inclusive education, Professor Singhal is exceptionally well placed to guide this conversation. We are so lucky to have her amongst members and co-chairs of the Research Collaborative. So we're truly grateful for your leadership and for the contributions of each panelist joining us this evening. Everyone, please welcome Professor Singhal and our esteemed panel.
So thank you so much, Jackie. Those very kind words. And wow, Yasmin, what can I say? That was just so energetic and powerful and just everything. You got energy into the room. So thank you so much for that. And thank you so much for your leadership and your vision. You continue to inspire everybody. Absolutely brilliant. So thank you ever so much for that. That is absolutely amazing. So very quickly, I'm going to do a visual description of myself. I'm not even going to talk about my height. I have South Asian heritage, I have brown skin, I have mid-length black hair, and I'm wearing a colorful jacket with black trousers. And I'll invite my panelists to give their visual description after I have introduced you guys. Okay, so now we're going to shift gears after absolutely setting the ground, being inspired to really a critical conversation which builds on the themes of why we're here today. So this panel, which I'm absolutely honored to chair, looks at a very vital and timely question. So the question we are posing is, how can education systems across levels and across the globe be strengthened to provide meaningful, comprehensive support for children and youth with intellectual and developmental disabilities? A really vital thing to be thinking about right now. And as Yasmin and Jackie have already alluded to, the core of our discussion is going to be framed by the global research agenda for building inclusive learning environments, and the copies available, so do help yourself to those before you leave the room, because I think it's absolutely a gripping read. It outlines key strategies and foundational principles on how we could advance inclusion. And the agenda really covers 6 core themes, which are going to be the core of the conversation also. And I'm going to list out the 6 themes. The first is defining inclusion across context and cultures. And I think that's so important, not just inclusion in a linguistic way, but also what does it mean in practice. And we've heard a lot about contextualizing research in the main summit also. The second theme is around building the capacity of educators, coaches, and other adults. The third theme is looking at strengthening family, school, and community engagement. The fourth one looks at driving impact through measurement and evidence. Absolutely, how do you turn research into practice? Fifth is looking at supporting underserved and displaced populations. And the final one, looking at leveraging artificial intelligence to foster inclusion, totally timely in so many ways. So the goal here is very much to generate actionable insights, foster collaboration across different stakeholder groups. So we're talking about researchers, educators, policymakers, and advocates. Really identify the knowledge gaps and propose very practical, scalable solutions, which the aim is to really drive systemic change. The aim is very much to ensure all children and youth with intellectual development disabilities have access to inclusive, supportive, and empowering, really very much about how do you make education to, in, and through happen through the learning environments that these young people inhabit. On that note, having set the scene for the research agenda, I'm going to turn my attention to welcoming three very distinguished members and two co-chairs of the research collaborative. So I'm going to give a small description and then turn to you to just give a visual description of yourself. So I'm going to first of all go to the far end of the room and go to Professor Iman Gad, who you are the Dean of the Faculty of Education and Professor of Spatial and Inclusive Education at the British University in Dubai, and you are the co-chair of the Research Collaborative. So very warm welcome to the panel, and could you give a short visual description, please?
Hi, I'm Dedra Gorgeous, beautiful.
Totally agree.
I am a pretty in pink today. Actually, I am a 5'4", and I have medium skin, Mediterranean look. I'm a native Egyptian, British citizen, been living in the Emirates for donkey's years, so I'm totally confused, a global citizen. I'm wearing black and a pink blazer, and I have the honor to be here today.
Thank you so much, Iman. So next person is Dr. Emily Morris, and you're a fellow at the Center for Universal Education of the Brookings Institution and a research collaborative member. So over to you.
Thank you. It's great to be here and great to see all of you. I am a middle-aged woman, but young at heart, and I'm wearing a blue and white blazer, and I'm the same height as my colleague Iman to my left. And what else to say? I have dark hair.
Thank you, Emily. So last but not the least, Professor Christy Patton, who is the professor and counselor to the president at New York University and a co-chair of the Research Collaborative. So over to you.
Hello, it's so wonderful to be here. And I love the blue jacket. Sky's the limit with the blue sky. I'm in New York black and all black. And as a member of a president's cabinet at an institution of higher education right now in the United States, I think it's fitting. I'm 5'9". I have chemically blonde hair. And then also I am months away from being 60, which I am very excited about because all my friends tell me that when you're 60, you get very wise. So I'm waiting for the wisdom. So my fellow 60-year-olds, I'm coming for you in a couple months.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And once again, thank you to all of you. Okay, so we're going to move on to the first question, and my first question is to Christy, very much. So can you please, for us, set the stage for the research agenda by first explaining the background of it? I think that's really important for us to understand. Why was it established? What's our vision, goal here? And indeed, the composition, so who participated in both in relation to geography and diversity. So over to you.
Great, and this was Sammy's question, so I just want to acknowledge Sammy not being here, and it's very unfortunate. I think it speaks to some of the issues that individuals have in getting around, and he would have done a much better job than me in answering this question. He has been such a pleasure to have as a significant part of the Research Collaborative. So I was in Abu Dhabi before the Games. I taught a class at NYU Abu Dhabi for years, and when Special Olympics came to the UAE, there was a significant shift. There was a significant shift by Special Olympics presence and their partnership with the UAE in that you could tell there was this drive for inclusion, there was this drive to be committed to the idea of it, not only the idea of inclusion, but action around inclusion. So that's when the Global Center was founded, like Jackie mentioned, in 2019. And then shortly after that, in 2022, I believe, the Research Collaborative was formed. And that was a collection of scholars from across the globe with a real desire to make sure that we had the Global South representation. You know, so many of these research collaboratives that I've been a part of, or these international research collaboratives, are heavily weighted towards European nations, the US, et cetera, North America. And we were committed to having that representation And part of my work, and one thing that I'm so proud that Special Olympics is leading the way on, is to have true partnerships with the Special Olympic athletes and the adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Part of the collaborative, we have another co-chair who's not here. Ben Hake is a former Special Olympic athlete who's co-chair of this research collaborative. So he's co-chairing a collaborative made up of 32 scholars. And when I look at that video of Sammy, and I wasn't going to say this, but I'm just struck by it, when you see the issues he had with being in school that didn't have best practices in inclusion, and weren't aware of the best practices in inclusion, he's now helping define a global research agenda for inclusion, which to me just speaks to the power of this and what we're trying to set out to do with this research agenda. And I think that from the standpoint of the scholars and how it came together, I'll talk a little bit about the motivation next, but how it came together was just getting a bunch of people in the room that care about the same thing and care about a cross-disciplinary international group that can really bring their expertise to this problem. And when we first got together, we all had pieces of the problem. Because academics are famous for being very insular in their work, and they do this topic where actually can be really boring. We know a lot about one thing, and we know about it very well. And I think that one of the things that this collaborative has done for us is really break down that and bring all these scholars together in a way that you now have in front of you the results of that.
Thank you for that. And I think that's such a solid point around two partnerships and ensuring that there is a lot of multidisciplinary collaboration and discussion. So could you just take this a little further and help understand what was the inspiration behind the development of the research agenda, and very much what are you hoping to achieve from this collaborative?
Sure. There are many motivations, I think, behind developing this. We were all committed to the idea of trying to develop, and this was not an easy process. It was, Jackie's laughing, it was not an easy process to bring 32 individuals, making sure we had representation globally to decide what would be a global research agenda. It's a pretty daunting idea when you think about establishing a global research agenda that focuses on individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities and centers their voices and centers their perspectives and centers their lived experiences. So I think we were all motivated to come together to figure that out. And there were drafts and I don't know how many iterations of this. Jennifer, who hasn't been mentioned but has been a wonderful partner, there were so many iterations, and we did convenings, and we did virtual convenings and in-person convenings supported by the Global Center in the UAE and Abu Dhabi until we were able to come to a consensus as to what were the key themes that you're going to be hearing about more today. And Needy's going to go through and ask different questions about these key themes. That doesn't mean we've covered all the themes. I think the motivation is, where do we start? Where do we start, and where do we start where we can really move from ideas to action and implementation? And how can what do we know, right? So what is the state of the field? But more importantly, what do we don't? What are the gaps? What's missing? Who's not at the table? And if you're not at the table, and in this case, if you don't have individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities at the research table deciding on the research question, my feeling has always been you're not doing it right. You're looking around the table and that's missing. So really, I think the motivation was many, and we all came to that space with different motivations, but all caring for the same thing, all caring for this idea of this is possible. This is possible to gather good, rigorous data and do ethical, inclusive research together.
Thank you for that, and that's a good segue into going into the first theme. So I'm going to turn to Emily, and maybe you could share with us why is it so essential to understand how do you define inclusion differently across different contexts and cultures, and very much maybe start by explaining a little of why don't we have a better sense of the definition variation.
Thank you. Our Global Research Collaborative is representing dozens of countries as well as dozens of languages. And so one of the things that we started with was really talking about and thinking about how do we define, what are our histories of inclusive education, but also looking at resource flows and thinking about what research exists, where it does not exist, and mapping that. And so with that, we have found, because of all of these different histories and resources and flows and conversations, that there are such different definitions. And one of the pieces that we needed to do was sit down and talk about those. So we spent not hours, but days and days, and it's still an ongoing conversations. And one of the contributions is mapping those definitions, talking about them, and understanding them. And so Sammy and I, for example, are both Swahili speakers. Any Swahili speakers here? No Swahili speakers here. But one thing, for example, in the 90s, if you were to ask what is the definition of inclusive education, you would have had elimu ya watu wenye ulemavu, which translates as education of a child with a disability. Later, the next decade, it was elimu wenye mahitaji maalum. So special education with special needs. And now, in the new policies in Tanzania and Kenya, elimu jumuishi is the terminology used, which is integrated or unity or coming of together. And so with this, we talk about sort of the evolution of language, and sometimes it's with resource flows, sometimes it's with sharing of knowledge, and sometimes it's with societies and how societies and history shift. So we have these conversations, and collectively we're making sure that we're really centering different histories, but also understanding and pushing against deficit framing in language. And how do we do that collectively across languages to push against deficit models, deficit ideas, and how do we do that and raise that to a global collective together, and to really think about the different contexts and not take those for granted.
Absolutely, and I think language conveys so many different things. There's a wonderful book called Bad Mouthing, and it really sums up quite a few of these issues. So thank you so much for that. So moving on, let's shift focus on to how do you bring inclusion really to life every day amongst educators and coaches? And this is where, Iman, I'd love to hear from your perspective, rather we would all love to hear from your perspective. What does research need to tell us about the knowledge, skills, and values that educators and coaches must develop to effectively create inclusive learning environments, especially for the learners that are of focus here, intellectual and development disabilities?
Absolutely. Three things: knowledge, skills, and values. Knowledge-wise, we know that there is a gap of knowledge. That's why we have the research collective. That's why we have people from across the globe trying to bridge this gap. However, knowledge is extremely important to be research-based evidence. You can't just make up knowledge. We know that culture and cultural attitude affect the knowledge. We know about myths and taboos. We are here to make sure that knowledge is shared in a value that is shared between everybody. Knowledge is basically, we need to arm people with knowledge that is not objective, that is not directed, that is not politicized, knowledge that are clear based on facts here and facts now. When it comes to skills, as an educator, a professor of inclusive education, teachers, educators, paraprofessionals always suffer from lacking skills. We know that when you lack skills, you're frustrated. If you're frustrated, you can't have an inclusive environment. We argue and we say that you have to have the least restrictive environment. You have to make sure that the child is, listening to Sami and what happened to him. You need to have a welcoming environment that is supportive, but without arming teachers with differentiated instructor skills, environment that supports inclusivity and make him welcome in every way, and also have the knowledge tailor-made for him to have an equal and equitable opportunity. We can't do this. Research does this for us. Research supports us to support the teachers to the know-how, not just the talk. We walk the walk, not just talk the talk. Last but not least, values. I always believe that if every single person in the school, is not sharing the values, we don't have inclusive education. From the doorman, to the janitor, to the supporter, the paraprofessional, and of course the head teacher or the headmistress. We have to have a cohesive, collective approach to this. We have to have a shared value. It is a right. Every day is a missed opportunity. So unless we all believe in this, and we can tailor-make it, we can tier it, we can talk it in a very simple language, and we talk with academics in a very posh language, as Chris was saying. Basically, it's very important to have a shared value. So knowledge, skills, and values must be unified, aligned, and cohesive. Otherwise, we will never have inclusive education.
Thank you so much. And that's such a powerful point to also make a distinction between equality and equity and shared values. Absolutely. But we also know that educators do not work in vacuum, right? So there are lots of other stakeholders in the ecosystem. And the success of inclusive learning often depends on the strength of the relationships between schools, families, and communities. So just focusing on that, I'm going to turn to Emily again. What do we already know about how families, schools, and community partnerships influence the success of inclusive education?
I'm very, very passionate about family and community and school engagement and education. And one of the things that we've been pushing at the collaborative is how do we bring families into the center? And oftentimes in education research, families are on the periphery, and on systems transformation efforts, they're on the periphery. So our work as a collaborative is also how do we bring families and caregivers? They are experts in their children. They are their children's first educators. They are allies to schools. And we know from the research that when there are strong partnerships, children succeed academically, socio-emotionally, but also teachers succeed. And families feel better. And so one of the things we've also been trying to do with the research is how do we shift families who are often put in a situation of having to be very reactive, fighting for the rights of their children, for resources, for services, into a space of proactive, where they can partner, they can further, and they can support the schools in really delivering family, school, and community engagement together. So with this, we're also looking at, within the field of family, school, community engagement, we often have little research, and we have a lot of research gaps, particularly with families that speak another language at home than in the school. Families, children living with an elderly caregiver or a sibling caregiver, families living in displaced communities, and other legal statuses. So we also want to center families and not assume families are a monolith, and that understand the caregivers, right, and caregivers' role in supporting their children and bringing them into the ecosystem.
Absolutely, and I think it's really important again to realize that it's more about acknowledging that some cultures and contexts, they're more collective societies, so absolutely. Now let's pivot to something a little more future-facing, and maybe turning to a theme on artificial intelligence, and the questions very much for Christy about, so what is the promise of AI, and what is the potential risk of AI, and how do we ensure artificial intelligence is really leveraged to fostering inclusion?
Okay, so this is the audience participation part of the program.
Oh.
Raise your hand if you think AI is going to transform inclusive education. For the good, sorry, for the good. A couple people put their hands down. Transform inclusive education for the good. Raise your hand. Hands up. Okay, good. Raise your hand if you feel that AI and inclusive education will just reinforce ableistic biases.
Let's be in the middle.
Raise your hand if you feel like it could be both. There we go, consensus. Okay, so that's what we're talking about in this space, and that's what this part of the research theme seeks to understand. You know, you can go to a lot of conferences and hear about the magical wonder of AI and the transformative power of AI. AI, a couple things about that. AI is trained on data. We know AI is trained on data. So I'm going to have another pop quiz for you. If you were training AI to understand the power of disability of Academy Award winners, of disabled actors, how many data points would you have? Actors with disabilities that won an Academy Award. 3. 2 that were deaf, and 1 from the 40s that was an amputee from World War II that played an amputee from World War II. 3 actors. That's a very small data set. So you begin to see the problem. You begin to see the problem with what is being referred in the literature as automated ableism. We know we have ableism in the disability community. AI can automate that ableism. So we know that's something that we want to look at in this research agenda. You know, we didn't want this theme to just be the power of AI, which we will also look at, and how it can be leveraged. You know, Special Olympics Latin America, I believe it was, that did that video. Is anyone here from Special Olympics Latin America? Your video was phenomenal. You know which video I'm talking about? The AI representation in sports.
Yes.
And when you look and when you ask AI to give me an athlete, you might get an athlete with a physical disability, but you almost never get an athlete with intellectual and developmental disability. They're missing. So AI really focuses on trying to find the sameness. The algorithms, there's a bias towards similarity. And we know that means there's a bias against difference. So how are we going to address that as a research community that is fundamentally related to the needs of the disability community? And how can we be leaders in that space? And how can we really question some of the assumptions around that, but also look at the ethical frameworks that are being used? And this isn't going to be, I'm a disability researcher. I do research around systematic change and large-scale inclusion programs. I need to be in partnership with engineers, with data scientists. You know, and how do we create these coalitions in these, what I would think would be a think, do tank, forget the think and do, because AI is changing by the second, in ways that we know that our communities are represented, and they're represented in a strength-based way versus this automated ableism that I've talked about. And how can we really begin to understand that? The time is yesterday for this, I feel, in many ways, because it does change so quickly. But I will say, Special Olympics International and the Research Collaborative, by putting this as a key research theme, I think we're going to be helping to lead the way, and the people that are involved in this. So open call here too. If you are interested in this area, please reach out and let us know, because we really are moving forward in ways that can begin to really look at these questions and consider the power and the leverage and the strengths, but also we want to make sure that we're not reinforcing what we know is already out there from an ableism perspective.
And I think that's so important, not playing catch up later, saying, oh, we should have looked at disability. So thank you for that, Christy. Emily, I'm going to turn to you. So we've heard throughout the day, over the last 2 days, really powerful insights about the promise of inclusion, right? But we've also heard Yasmin talk about the challenges faced by underserved and displaced populations in many parts of the world. So what unique challenges do low and middle income countries face in building inclusive education systems for learners with intellectual and developmental disabilities, and how can research really be used to address these challenges?
And I'm channeling my friend Sammy, who was supposed to speak to this question. But I think yesterday, His Majesty King Abdullah II said this really well, that displaced communities are exceptionally impacted. And we have found that in the research. That's why we're centering this in the research agenda. And we're finding that this is true for teacher professional development, for school infrastructures, for things that families and communities are grappling with trauma. And so we also want to study and think about that in diverse ways and talk about that in diverse ways. Displaced communities are not a monolith. They're diverse and they have diverse experiences. So how do we also bring diversity to our methods and our research questions? But how do we also address that families are also dealing with housing and food insecurity, trauma, and grappling with legal statuses as part of the research that we're doing. One example, I've been collaborating for a long time with teams in northern Uganda and the West Nile, where there's refugees, communities, and families from 3 different nations. And one of the things that we found with doing research is that even just trying to identify and understand, asking a parent or a caregiver, does your child have a disability on a survey as a school entry, is a challenge. And one parent and caregiver said very clearly, sometimes I can't tell where there's a disability or a delay or this child is just experiencing trauma, or it's a result of trauma, it's a consequence of food, it's a consequence of fear. And so schools are grappling with that every day. How do we give the supports and resources, and how do we center that, but how do we also understand that? And so we need greater research questions to really understand and unpack that. And we need to also center our colleagues and our organizations and our communities that are doing this amazing work, but often don't receive enough resources and support globally to do this work. And I'll end with kind of a quote from His Majesty, the King Abdullah II, who said at the end of his address yesterday that we have to envision what could be and summon courage and unity to work together. And this really holds true to our collaborative and collective, that we really want to shape global research policy and practice that not only fills in the gaps, but that creates a new vision and re-envisions. And I'll hand to my colleague, Dr. Aman, who will just speak a little bit further.
Right. Again, acknowledging Sami, who's not here. Based on what we just heard, I think one of the main issues that we saw doing this collaborative research is that we had a hunch that, when parents are involved, we always have better and effective inclusive education. But research-based evidence are needed here to support our hunch. We can't just rely on this, we need facts. And we know the following from our research case studies around the globe. We have scholars from every corner. I'm so proud to be part of this. Every corner of the universe, we have somebody there doing research on inclusive education. Isn't that amazing? So what do we have here? We know these facts, and those facts are research-based evidence. We know that when parents are involved, inclusive education is more effective. We know that when IEP, Individualized Educational Plan, is turning into IEFP, Individualized Education Family-Based and Family-Centered Plan, inclusive education is effective. We know that you can have all the legislation in the world, you can have all the government supported, you can have all the speeches and all the summits, but if you don't have the family involved, inclusive education doesn't work. When the child leaves school, so-called inclusive schools or pretended inclusive school or covert exclusion school, and he goes home, this is where inclusion starts. Inclusion starts not with a fight, but with a passion. So with the compassion, the passion of the families, research says to us that we need to help and need that in order to complete this cycle. We know that inclusive education, research tells us as well, that it's the right, exactly like food, clean water, shelter. Inclusive education is a right. We need to stress on that. And our research agenda here says that and proves it, not just believe in it, but actually proves it with our collaborative research or cross-cultural collaborative research.
Thank you so much for that, Emily and Aman. Absolutely. I mean, wow, within the very short time, we've covered a whole range of different issues, from redefining inclusion across cultures to leveraging AI, strengthening education capacity, supporting displaced learners. Imagine if we had more time, what we could have done. But nonetheless, change really depends on what we do next, right? So, Aman, really over to you. So now is the time when inclusive education and focusing on inclusion is even more important than anything else, right? I mean, it is the time. So what is the most important message you want us here, collective, to leave with?
I have so many messages, but I'm limited to the time and also need to hit hard. Mainly, we urge interested groups and individuals to join us in this vital endeavor to close knowledge gaps. We have a huge problem with knowledge gap. Everybody is basically working in a pocket. We need collaboratively to work on that. We need to advance the policies and practice, and we need to look at that through bridging the gap. Those practices that drive positive and long-lasting impacts for the inclusion of children and youth with IDD. We have a huge problem when it comes to sustained and long-lasting impact. We don't need to plan for today, we need to plan for the future and forever, for next generations. We aim to identify and improve, not just identifying the transformative power that high-quality, evidence-based, inclusive programming and practices can have on the educational experiences of youth with and without IDD. Remember, inclusion is not just about people with IDD or people with disability, it's about everybody. It's a right-based, everyone right to exist and in dignity and respect. Building awareness of existing gaps in knowledge and practice that must be collectively addressed and maximize positive outcomes for individuals with IDD across cultures and learning contexts. And last but not least, basically to persuade policymakers. And as a policymaker, I was the director of disability services. I've always been an advocate, and when I was appointed in the government of Dubai many years ago as a director of disability services, I said, great, now I can do what I like. It's very hard. It's not easy when you are in operation. So what we want to do is we want to persuade policymakers and generation of benefits of inclusion and related research, from stronger educational outcomes to more resilience economies. I mean, if you read our policies here, and specifically when it comes to the benefit and the basically economic powers of inclusivity, you would know what we're talking about. We need urgent and collective action. It is necessary to work together to create a world where inclusive education is the norm, not the exception. I'd like to end with a few words here. I would love to say time is to basically act now, but I always stress that every single day is a missed opportunity. We know the facts, we know the rules, we have the legislations, we have the powers, we have the compassion, we have the passion. But if we don't work together, we will be working in silos and pockets again. We need collective effort to make this happen. Thank you very much.
That is really powerful.